All right. Welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. Let's see, we've got an audio issue here. What is going on here? Hope if there's anybody watching right at this moment, please let me know if you can hear or not. But I am seeing an issue here. So let me just take one moment here. Let's see. Everything looks good there. And let's see. Nope. Let me see. Anybody feel like there's an audio issue here? That's kind of weird. Let's go with testing. All right. Well, we will continue on, and I will assume that everybody can hear. I'm just having an issue with the audio in my headset, so I am not hearing myself, which sounds a little bit weird. But we will assume that everybody else out there can hear. And in the meantime, I will work to try to figure out what in the world is going on my end. At any rate, if you're tuning in live, I want to thank you for giving me your time so early. Today, I'm going to review the debate that Dave Smith was in. It was actually four people. It was Dave Smith, Dennis Prager, Cenk, and I don't know how to say his last name, and then Batya. Again, I don't know how to say her last name either. But all of them participated in a zero hedge debate. And so I will be reviewing that today, not in the context of what they said and do I agree with this argument and do I agree with that argument. That was for the debate to work out and for people, in the audience to determine, hey, do I think they made a good argument? So I'm not really looking to make that. I'm not really looking to accomplish that. What I want to accomplish is what can we learn as audience members and how can we, how do we, what kind of takeaway can we get from the debate itself? So we will be going through that. I've got several clips, and I will warn you ahead of time. The clips that I'm playing, they are not. I don't have them set up such that the the clips will necessarily make sense on their own. Some of them will, some of them won't, because I've kind of edited them. I edited them for the purposes of, making them shorter so that we could get to the point that I want to make, not so much to hear what they're saying. So some of them will kind of sound a little bit awkward. There should be enough context for the purposes of this episode, but it may kind of sound a little bit weird when you're listening to it and you might say, well, that kind of didn't really make sense what they just said. And it's possible that I edited it. So bear with me on that. The other thing that I want to point out for those who will be just listening to this, whether you're listening to it on Spotify when I get it out, or if you're watching on YouTube, but you're not really paying attention to the screen, I will do my best to describe anything that requires a visual because some of the things that I want to talk about are, kind of like what I see, and you may or may not be able to see that. So I just wanted to kind of give you a heads up on that, and then we can, ensure that you understand how I've put this episode together and why the clips are the way they are, and some of the things that I have to say. So let's get into that first clip here, and this is Batya's opening, and I think it's a really interesting opening. Let me make some changes here really quickly. I'm gonna talk about Batya's opening and I'm talking about Dave's opening because I think those are the ones that stood out to me the most. So let's go ahead and play Batya's opening.
Batya, why don't you go ahead? Batya Ungar-Sargon, she is opinion editor at Newsweek, and she's the author of Second Class, How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women, which we have a copy of on the desk right over there. She was so kind to give us one. Go ahead, Batya. You can go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be here with this panel. Are we all in agreement that Israel was just to invade after October 7th? Cenk, you agreed with that. Dennis, you obviously agreed with that. I agree with that. Dave, are you in agreement that that was there was a way that Israel could have conducted itself that you would have felt comfortable with that as a reaction to October 7th? Is that accurate?
So why don't we cut the questions there? Continue with your opening statement. We'll get to
I think that's very important because then we can narrow the scope of the debate. It doesn't have to be about whether the war is just, but whether Israel's behavior since invading was just and the way that it has carried it out.
Okay. So, and I'm still having this weird audio. I don't know what's going on with my audio and why I do not hear it in my headset, but that's just the way it is. And everything looks like it's set up. I don't know. Anyway, I will be distracted probably throughout this episode until I figure out what's going on with the audio. Everything seemed to be working until I went live, which is how things go. At any rate, Batya. The one thing that I didn't like that she was asking questions. So I think when you're in a debate and your questions should be more rhetorical as necessary rather than trying to get somebody else to actually respond, because that is your time to open up and let the audience know exactly what it is. They say, tell them what you're going to say, then tell them what you want to say, then tell them again. That's the general rule of public speaking, that you reiterate everything. And so your opening is to let people know kind of like, here's the foundation, here's where I'm going, here's what you will be hearing from me today. And instead, she opens it up and she's kind of asking Dave some questions, but she does something that I did think was interesting is in those questions, while she should have made it more of a rhetorical question rather than actually seeking an answer, which Dave at one point kind of did respond. And he was like, well, I don't know if you wanted to use your opening to ask me questions. And then the moderator kind of cuts in and he's like, hey, let's go ahead and cut the questions. Just get on with what you're opening. And so what she ends up doing is the purpose of the question was to kind of narrow the debate topic itself. And so they went from the debate topic, and I don't have it written down exactly what the debate topic was in specific, but she narrows it down to, was it moral and just for Israel to go in and militarily go into Gaza, to more, how is, like, since we all probably agree that, hey, it was moral for them to respond, now let's talk about the way that it's happened since that moment. And so she narrows the focus of the debate. And I thought that was I thought that was very good, because debates, a lot of times, especially if you're debating casually with somebody, debates have a tendency to go all over the place. And so if you can focus your debate to something very specific, and that lets everybody know, now we can cut all the extraneous stuff and focus on the debate itself, like the core, the most important part of the debate. Because ultimately, the debate really is about one thing. It's about bringing out all the different arguments and allowing people, the audience, to make heads or tails of those arguments. And so the more that you can get to the focus of a debate, the better off it's going to be for the audience, because the audience will be able to say, okay, well, they're debating this and they've narrowed it down to this element. This is what I should be hearing about. So I thought that was a really good, I thought in terms of her opening, that was a good opening. I just wish that she had not phrased it more of a rhetorical question, not to be answered so much, and more of a, hey, kind of almost making an assertion instead. So let's move on to Dave's opening, because I think Dave had an interesting opening as well. And for me, as somebody who aligns more with Dave, I found it a very value add, especially in our community where we like to go out and we like to debate things and we like to talk to people out and about in the world who may or may not be libertarian. So let's hear his.
Well, since we have a short opening here, I think I'll just respond to a couple things that I've heard you guys say so far. So one of the things that I noticed almost in every war is that it kind of drives people down to this most base collectivist understanding of what's going on here. This side is bad, this side is good, and no one really sees the nuance that there are individuals involved. So for example, just in the war between Ukraine and Russia, you see people who have the Ukrainian flag in their Twitter bio, and they celebrate when there's a Russian defeat. never really considering the fact that many of these Russian young boys were conscripted into this army and that they're victims too. And, you know, when Mr. Prager says one side wants peace and the other side wants to kill all of these people, it's a very convenient collectivist way to look at things. But the reality, the objective reality of the situation here is that there have been atrocities on both sides committed against the other side. This is true throughout the history of the existence of Israel. This is true before the existence of the state of Israel, when with the Zionist settlers, the British, the Arabs. There were atrocities committed on all sides. And to say that everybody, as if, or to imply that everybody on the Israeli side just wants peace and everybody on the Palestinian side just wants, that is just not true. There are lots of Palestinians who just want peace, and there are lots of Israelis who want their land and are quite willing and will openly, explicitly say they're willing to do whatever it takes to take their land. Let me just say this. If we look at things in not a collectivist way, and we recognize that there are individuals, and these individuals make up different groups. Let's say we have the group that is Hamas, made up of individuals, but that's Hamas. Within that group, we have the militant Hamas and we have the political arm of Hamas. They are different. We also have Israel, which is made up of its citizens. We have different political parties within Israel. Okay, let's take this one group for a second, the innocent Palestinians. I hope both of you would concede that such a group does exist. There are some people on the pro-Israel side who will explicitly tell you that that group does not exist. I think if we're being honest with ourselves, there is no group that has been more victimized than the innocent Palestinians. And at a certain point, maybe we ought to think about that group. Nobody has been through it worse than that group, the innocent Palestinians. And at a certain point, I think the question needs to be asked, does Israel have a right to do what it's been doing to the innocent Palestinians for many, many decades now?
Okay. So that was hey, I got my audio back. So I don't know what I did. Whatever button I pushed worked. Okay. What I like about Dave's response here, or not, I'm sorry, not his response, his opening here. And I apologize that I gave you a bit of a long one, but I wanted to make sure that you understood the context. So he talks about collectivism and individualism. This is big in the liberty community, and this is something that I felt really needed to be highlighted for members of the liberty community because we use these terms quite frequently. But we often use these terms without really laying out what does it mean to other people. I think we assume that other people just understand what we mean when we say individualism, collectivism. And these are, unfortunately, individualism probably more so. I would argue collectivism a little bit less so. And so what he does, he doesn't just use these words and say, hey, this is collectivist, this is individualist. He lays it out and he specifies exactly what it means. And he's like, you've got this group and you've got this group and you've got this group and you've got this group. And they're all part of like this larger group. But you break it down and he continually breaks down the groups so that people can understand, okay, as an individual, if I'm living in the Middle East, I may belong to one group, but not another group. So if you can imagine a bubble, not a bubble, a circle, imagine a circle, and that circle represents everybody in the Gaza conflict right now, Palestine and Israel, right? That's the whole group there. And then maybe in those circles, you've got two more circles. And so one of those circles now is Israel and one is Palestine. Okay. Those two circles are inside the larger circle. And then inside the Israel circle, you have yet two more circles, or maybe three, or however many. And you just keep breaking it down. And then you do the same thing in the Palestine circle. You break that one down. You say, okay, well, now we've got Hamas and we've got Palestinians. And then maybe in the Hamas one, you say, okay, well, we've got, because he mentions there's the political arm of Hamas, and then there's the violent extremist arm of Hamas. So there's the ones that are doing the politics, and there's the ones that are doing the violence, right? And he's just continually breaking it down. And then he does all of that, and then he leads to his major point, which is we have the innocent Palestinians. And then that becomes his focus. And I think this was a perfect demonstration of how to utilize collectivism, individualism in a conversation and ensure that people know exactly what you're talking about. We had when I was a Christian back in the day, in like the 90s, we used to have a phrase, we called it Christianese. And what we would tell fellow Christians is, like, when you come to church, there are terms and phrases and words and, all these things that how we would communicate. But then we'd go out to the outside world and we'd have to tell each other, don't forget, they're not in service with us. They're not familiar with all these terms in the way that we are. So if you just use them casually, you may be talking to a brick wall because they don't know what you're talking about. And a lot of people won't stop you and say, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Because it feels rude. Now, somebody might do it once or twice. They might, if there's a conversation and I happen to use the word collectivism and I don't define it or in some way describe it, then the person might say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by collectivism? They might say that. But if I'm using a bunch of them, chances are they're just going to nod their head and they're just going to be like, yeah, sure. Yeah. And I won't know how many words they don't actually understand. So I won't know how well I'm communicating with them because they're just going to fake it. And so I think Dave did a really good thing here, and it was on multiple fronts, right? Number one, he uses the terms and then he defines them and then he describes them. Well, actually, he describes them. I don't think he actually defined them. So he describes them, which is just as well. And then he uses that to get to his ultimate point, which is, today, I want to talk about the innocent Palestinians and the issue that I have with what's going on with them. And so it's very clear from his opening where he's going, which is what an opening should be. An opening should be basically you laying the foundation for what you plan to talk about so that people are prepared and they have an expectation of where you're going. And that goes the same for whether it's a speech or whether you're in a debate. You want to give the audience an idea of what to expect. All right, so let's move on to the next thing. We're going to talk about appearance. And I thought this was very interesting, body language and even actually attire. So let's talk about this. Let's watch this next clip and I will describe it. This one I'm going to do a little bit more describing. So if you are watching, I apologize that I'm going to describe it. That's for folk that may be just listening, whether they're listening on YouTube, just, in the background, or whether or not they're later listening on Spotify or iTunes or what have you.
Well, since we have a short opening
Oops.
here, I think I'll just respond to a couple things that I've heard you guys say.
But to
so
point
far.
out
All
that
right.
they
One
were
of the things
innocent
that-
Germans
There we
while
go.
the Nazis were in charge is
All right, let me restart that. I apologize, folks. I had the wrong one queued up there. So this one's going to be about body language, and I'm starting with Dennis Prager here. So let's restart that.
But to point out that they were innocent Germans while the Nazis were in charge is a morally idiotic point. It means nothing. It only means that every innocent German's life that was taken is the responsibility of the Nazis.
Okay, so if you notice in that, he's looking straight forward. So his debate partner is on the left of him, and the two people that he's debating, Cenk and Dave, they're on his right, and he's looking straight forward. Now, in fairness to Mr. Prager, he at the very beginning asked, where is the camera pointed? And I assume that, based on watching the video, that they have multiple cameras. So he's like, where is the camera? Where should I be kind of like focusing? But he does this thing throughout the whole video where he's almost only looking at the camera, with the exception of when he's addressing somebody very specifically. And in many cases, it seemed like he would only look at other people on the panel if he was addressing them and if he was a little bit on the emotional side, which is fine. But he doesn't seem to do it otherwise. And then he has a very stiff, he comes across as very stiff. He's sitting there. He's, he's straight up and he's got his hands in front of him and they're clasped. And he's just almost like he's a broadcaster from the 1950s, talking to an audience as neutral as he can, right? Like that's kind of the posture that I'm getting. But he actually doesn't even keep that. It gets a little bit So let's play this
Is the
next.
responsibility of the Nazis.
Something really staggering has
So-
happened in Gaza.
Here's Batya. She's talking, and you can kind of get a look at the whole panel right there. So you've got the moderator now. He's looking directly at Batya. Cenk is looking directly at Batya. I apologize, my logo is in the way, but Dave is also looking at Batya. And then you have Dennis Prager, who is looking straight forward, but he's not talking.
Since October 7th, which is there have been protests
So there it is again. He's
against
still looking
Hamas
forward.
for the first time there were protests actually recently in 2019, but they were quashed by Hamas in a very aggressive, violent way. But the people of Gaza, the innocent people of Gaza, yes, who you mentioned, are speaking out against Hamas because Hamas is stealing their food and their aid. And they are seeing, I mean, they've known all along the role Hamas plays in their oppression.
The point
Okay, so through that whole portion that I just played, Dennis is like looking straight forward. He doesn't even look at his own debate partner. And so now we're going to go to another clip here. I've just kind of made, added, took a bunch of different clips and kind of put them together to illustrate that he's got this very stiff posture throughout. And then it goes into this one here, which I'll describe in a second.
that he's trying to make is what does legitimate defense on the Israeli parts look like? And this is actually something I'd like to hear from Dennis.
Okay. So there it goes. So he was messing with his phone, which, okay, fine, that happens. I get it. Maybe he was, responding to a message or, whatever. Maybe he was just double checking a note that he had. So, it's very common for people to use their phones to keep notes on them and stuff like that. So I'm not too worried about that. But then when he puts the phone down, he's got his arms crossed here. In Toastmasters, which I'll talk about toward the end, or at the end, in Toastmasters, one of the things that we talk about is when you are in front of an audience, when you are speaking publicly, don't cross your arms because it kind of closes you off from the audience. And we can continue playing so you can see that it's not a momentary thing. It actually lasts, through this portion of the clip that I'm playing.
Yeah.
Part.
Well, we'll get to both.
Oh,
He's
I'm sorry.
Jake
Okay,
asking
sure.
about the Israeli part.
Well,
So we're talking
Right. So there's some
It's-
crosstalk here. So there's crosstalk now. And again, Dennis is face forward, arms crossed. And the problem here is it really closes him off. And it signals to me that he actually doesn't want to be there. That's the impression that I get from him. He's focused on the camera. He only seems to direct, his eyesight toward the other people when he's addressing them. And frequently he comes across as a bit on the emotional side, which is fine. Others did that as well. Dave did it. Cenk did it. I know that at one point Dave was kind of throwing his hands up or stuff like that. And then Cenk, a few times would, he would get emotional and he would do the mocking tone. And, so like everybody had a little bit of room for improvement there. But again, those were you can think of those as moments that they had where it comes across more from Mr. Prager that he doesn't, I just really got the feeling that he didn't want to be there. And so I was like, and I just kept watching. I was like, man, you just don't seem to be interested in this debate at all. And it almost came across like he couldn't believe that this debate even had to be had. Like, how dare you even have this conversation? And so I just really got the feeling, and it's hard to, I don't want to repeat myself too much here, and I know I am, but it just feels like he didn't want to be there. He's got his arms clasped. He's got, he's folded his arms, closing himself off, which is generally, considered a no-no, in public speaking. And I know he knows this, right? He's been public speaking for, I don't know how many, probably, more years. I don't know how old he is, but I assume he's been public speaking for about as many years as I've been alive. So he is no stranger to this. This is not something new. He should understand. He's probably been in debates. And so I assume, and I don't know how maybe this is his general demeanor when he's in debates. I don't really know. I can just go by what I saw here. And the idea behind this is that, and I've said this before, I align more with the position that Dave and Cenk took, not the position that Dennis and Batya took. But Batya and Dennis, their job is to try to convince me away from my position, or at least to temper it so that I start saying, okay, well, you are giving me a good point. Okay, that's something I should consider more, so on and so forth. But Dennis doesn't, his body language doesn't lead to that. It's very off-putting and just, like when you're talking to human beings, it's not just about did they make a logical argument. It's how they came across. I can make a logical argument and be screaming at you, or I can make a logical argument and I can be talking at you in a normal voice where I'm just, it's soft, it's easy to listen to, and that's going to come across as more convincing to you than if I'm yelling at you. That's just how humans operate. So this is a whole package. You can't separate part of the package when you're communicating with people. Body language is part of that package. And so I thought that he did it pretty poorly consistently throughout the entire debate. Whereas the others, they were, if you watch the video in full, you'll notice that they're open. They've got their arm when they're talking, maybe their hands are open, or when they're just listening to somebody else, they've, and I can't show you an example because of the way my setup here is, but imagine that I've got, like one arm kind of extended out to the side of me and the other arm kind of, folded where I'm kind of, leaning on kind of my elbow and I'm leaning forward in. There's a little bit of openness in my body language, which says, I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. So therefore, it it makes you feel like I'm putting more attention into what you are saying. And just Dennis didn't come across that way. There's just no way, there's no other way to say it. Okay, so another thing that I noticed, and let me see if I can't go back and find a what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm not going to play the audio, but we will.
But to point out that
Oops.
there were innocent Germans
Hold
while
on.
the Nazis were in
I'll pause that for a second. So that's not the one that I wanted to go down. Let's see here. Put that down. And then let's play this real quick. And I'm going to kind of go through and see if we can. Okay, there we go. Right there. Okay, pause that for just a second. So here's a good shot of everybody on the screen. So you can see that the moderator has a tie on, absolutely appropriate. Dennis had a tie on. That's fine. No big deal. As a rule of thumb, they tend to say that it's better to overdress than to underdress. Cenk has a button-up shirt and a sport coat. Batya has, something that's appropriate for a woman, if she's not wearing a suit. And then you have Dave over here who is wearing a t-shirt and it looks like just kind of like a coat, like not a coat, like a little jacket, right? Now, I'm not going to criticize Dave for that so much, but what I am going to say is you are better off putting on at least a button-up shirt or maybe even a tie in most cases. Because, again, as I said, this is a package. And so when people look at you, they're going to observe the whole package. And that's going to give them a vibe, a feel. So in normal situations, I would advise against Dave from doing this. Or let me rephrase that. I would advise against people doing what Dave did. And the reason is so that when they first see you, it's like that first impression. You don't want to give them a bad impression. So they've already, if their first impression is, man, this person couldn't even dress up for the event, now their mind is set against you. So you have to work harder for them to hear you and what you're saying. To Dave's credit, he did so phenomenal that he gets past it easily. That's not most people. And so, and you see this in the business world. People will do things like, who was it? Richard Branson. He would frequently do wild and crazy things for business, and he frequently dressed casual. You had Hugh Hefner, who was wearing pajamas half the time. Some people can pull this kind of a thing off. Some people can pull off the more casual look. Part of pulling it off means that you are prepared to deliver everything else so solidly that the audience can't help but ignore it. So when we're watching Dave, when we're listening to Dave, he's spouting books. He's got names of people. He's got dates. He's got events, and he's coming off just like snap, 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 very, very quickly. So it's very, very clear, and it doesn't take long. It's very clear he came and he's very knowledgeable about this topic. He's very well prepared. When you watch the debate, you'll notice that people will bring up an event, like Dennis and other people will bring up an event from the past. And then Dave responds, he's like, you're right. And this and this and this and this person and that person. And, what happened before, what happened after, so on and so forth. So he's very on the spot. He's very on it when it comes to debating and having the knowledge and the information, which allows him to basically get away with dressing down a little bit in comparison to the others. And so I'm not criticizing Dave so much. I'm just pointing out, if you're going to be this kind of a person that says, like, I'm going to dress casual, how I feel, that's fine. But know that when you're communicating, you are a package. The package includes, like I said with Dennis, the body language. It includes your attire, how you're dressing. I mean, it depends on where you're going. You don't always need to wear a tie necessarily. If you're speaking casually at a bar to some people, yeah, you might, just a t-shirt might work, right? It just depends. But if you're going to be dressed down in a sense compared to the others that are there, then the other elements that go into the communication between you and the audience need to be that much better, because you are going to effectively need to compensate for that first initial look. So if David went in there dressed in the way that he is, and he was just average, he was just okay, he couldn't cite any books, and maybe he knew a couple of names and a couple of events, but otherwise was just trying to make an argument, it wouldn't have came across as well. But more importantly, what would happen is people would assume that their initial judgment of his appearance was correct. Because remember, Dave is a comedian. And one of the things that we see all the time on Twitter, people are like, oh, you're just a comedian, what would you know, right? And so people immediately start by judging. They judge books by the cover, whether they should or not, they do. And people do that all the time to Dave. They're like, well, you're just a comedian. And the way that he gets around that is to be so on top of the knowledge that it just basically annihilates the argument of you're just a comedian. Same thing with how you dress. If he were, he's wearing a t-shirt, and if somebody were to say, well, yeah, dude, you wore a t-shirt to this formal debate. Well, that argument loses weight very quickly when you start hearing him speak, because he's so knowledgeable and he's so able to bring that knowledge right on, on cue. So again, if you're going to dress down a little bit, then you need to be prepared to be one of the best in the room. That's just the way it works, because you're a package deal. So I just wanted to point that out. So in general, as a rule of thumb, most people, they shouldn't do that. Most people should dress more like about how Cenk dressed, with a sport coat and then a button-up shirt. And that's you don't have to wear a tie, but a tie is fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with Dennis wearing a tie. The moderator absolutely should wear a tie, because it kind of helps signify that he is running the show. So not that he's the most important part, but that he is in some way authority. So he has to kind of look authoritative while he's on there. And of course, he also has to act authoritative as well. I just wanted to point that out. When it comes to body language, those things matter. And it doesn't matter whether I know a lot of my fellow libertarians are like, hey, it shouldn't matter whether I wear a t-shirt. It does. It doesn't matter. Disregard what should be the case. The fact of the matter is, it does. And the only way that you can minimize that is to be extraordinary in another area that's part of that package of communication. And if you're not going to be extraordinary in those, then you're better off keeping everything about level. That's really what it amounts to. All right. So let's go to this next clip here. This next clip is of Dave, and this is where he reiterates a point at a later part of the debate. He reiterates something that he said at the very beginning in his opening. So let's take a listen.
Right.
Time.
So, but let's talk
scandal.
about this a little bit, because I think this all kind of ties together here, and it's one of the points that Dennis just made, where you said, look, Israelis don't want to occupy these territories, and that certainly is true. This is my point about being collectivist versus individualist. That is
Okay, so there it is again, the collectivist, individualist. Again, if you're going to use terminology, make sure that you've clarified what it means. You either define it in simple terms or you describe it so that people understand how this definition works. That way they know what you're talking about and they can follow along. And we have to be cognizant of the terminology that we use. Not every term, this is part of reading the room. We have to understand what the speaker is saying. And in the moment, it's like if you're listening to somebody and they use a bunch of, what they call $10 words, words that are obscure and just make you sound really, really smart. If you use one, probably can get away with it. But if you use like 10 of them, then you need your audience ought be and high, some an audience that for sure understands those words. And the same thing goes with jargon that is very common to your group. And in this particular case, collectivism is a very common term that the Libertarian Party uses, members of the Libertarian community use. Whereas when I'm out and about and I'm talking to other people, I almost never hear the term ever. And so it would be unclear to me if I were to use it, if I'm in a store and I strike up a conversation with somebody while I'm waiting in line and I use the word collectivist, I would not be sure that the person understood it because it's used so infrequently in casual conversations. And so therefore it would be worth me laying out what collectivist means. But now that he's laid it out, he can reuse that term again later.
true for many, many Israelis. There are lots of them who were very happy. They were all behind Yitzhak Rabin. Let's make a deal. We don't want to be occupying these guys anymore, right? But then there's also members of the Likud party and people like Benjamin Netanyahu. And one of the explicit reasons, which he has stated in his own words and many high-level Israelis, I could read quotes to you guys for the next hour if you want. They've all said it. The reason why they wanted to prop up Hamas was not only, as Cenk said, so that the international community would never recognize Palestinians, but so that those Israeli citizens wouldn't be able to put pressure on them. Because if it was the PA in charge, so many people in Israel would say, hey, they want to make a deal, let's make a deal. And so the Likud party cynically, intentionally funded and propped up this terrorist organization that is every bit as bad as you've said, Mr. Prager. I agree with you on that. But here's the deal.
Okay, so I think he did something else that's really good here. He said, Hamas is every bit as bad as you say they are. I agree with you. I think it's important that as we're talking, as we're framing our argument, and then we're laying out our argument, that we do our best to ensure that the other person understands where we at least agree. Because I think of argument and debate as simply, if I'm debating somebody about any topic, it doesn't matter. There is a point there is a certain portion of that argument for which we might agree. But there comes a point where we branch, right? We go in different directions and we don't agree. And so it's very good to make sure you come back to that. You might think of it as the split in the road. Come back to that. This is where we stopped agreeing, but don't forget what we do agree upon. Because the essence of a debate, the essence of communicating is to get somebody to accept your ideas. And if they feel like you're just against everything, then it's going to be much more difficult for somebody to accept those ideas. Whereas if you can bring them back and you can say, okay, don't forget, this is where we agree and this is where we don't agree. And here's why I'm saying why we've split at this particular point and why I think you need to consider my point. And then, of course, in this case, he's going back to this foundation that he laid at the very beginning, talking about collectivism and individualism. And he's already defined them and he's described them. So now he can freely use them. And as he's using them, he's describing them again. So let's continue listening.
Right. So if that's true, which we all know is true, if that's true that the Likud party propped up Hamas so they wouldn't face internal pressure and they wouldn't face external pressure to give the Palestinians their freedom, then I'm sorry, that blows up the Israeli defense for this war. That, hey, it sure does suck that we got to kill these innocent people, but we got to get these Hamas. You propped up Hamas so that these innocent people would never get their freedom. You don't then get to use that group as an excuse for why you can slaughter them.
Okay, so if you remember at the very beginning in his opening, he talks about collectivism, he talks about individuals, and then he describes it and he starts laying out all these different groups of people. And he's like, okay, you've got some Israelis that are that believe this way, you've got other Israelis that believe this way, you've got Hamas, you've got Palestinians. Now let's talk about Palestinians. And so he lays out the foundation, which is, I want to talk about innocent Palestinians. Well, now that he's done that, later on in the debate, he can freely, again, use collectivism and individualism, but then he can freely use these different groups. And it's very clear that he's viewing them distinctly. So there's no ambiguity, because a lot of times in this particular debate, a lot of times what you see happening is that people will merge Hamas and Palestinians, and they will just basically treat them as one group. Well, at the very beginning, Dave separated them, and then he does it again, and he reiterates his point. He's like, this is what I'm talking about. Well, we got collectivism and individualism. And then he goes on and he starts speaking about these groups as they're separate. This is important because when we're discussing ideas, when we're communicating, a lot of times it happens where people will basically conflate two ideas or two groups of people or more than that. And so what we want to do is, if there is a distinction that must be made, then we are at the and if that's part of my argument, then it's on me to make that distinction for the person that I'm speaking to or the person that's listening in the case of an audience. That's my job. Dave does it very well. He, again, starts out at the very beginning and he lays it out and says, all right, here's this distinction. Let me describe the distinction. Now that I've described it and I've separated all these different groups of people, and I'm sure that if he sat down on a piece of paper and he wrote down all the different groups of people, it might even be more than what he laid out in his introduction. But that's okay. He doesn't have to list out every single one of them. He just has to list them out enough so that he sets the tone that there are different groups of people that we must evaluate separately, and we cannot lump them in all together. And then that allows him later to continue making this distinction as part of his argument. And then while he's making this argument, he says, look, and there's a point for which we do agree on something. We agree that Hamas, who I have, I'm speaking on kind of like in Dave's stead here. We agree that on Hamas, they are terrible, evil people. Totally agree with you, 100%. But these Palestinians are not the same group. They need to be treated differently. We need to evaluate them differently. This is my big concern. And so it all works very well in the totality of his argument, because the argument is we cannot treat the people living in Gaza as a single entity. And it breaks down further from there, right? Like, you have Palestinians, and then you have your Palestinians who are under 18, who have never voted. So when people want to make the argument, well, they voted for this, this is where you can continue making that breakdown and say, okay, well, remember how I made a distinction that you have different groups of people. Well, that distinction goes further. There are Palestinians who voted, and some of them, yes, they did vote for Hamas, but there are many who did not vote for Hamas. And that is yet another group. And so you just keep working yourself down. Now, in the libertarian community, depending on the argument, we might work ourselves down to the individual. Sometimes it's not necessary. Sometimes it's okay to only go down part of the way and say, okay, let's talk about Palestinians as, as the innocent group. And this is the group that I want to talk about. And sometimes you don't go all the way down because it's not really necessary. You're just trying to talk about like this event, this action is happening to an entire group of people. But I want to make sure that we distinguish which group of people that I'm concerned about. And in the debate with Gaza and, the conflict between Hamas or Palestine and Israel, it's very, very important to make these distinctions. But these distinctions also apply in other arguments where it's maybe not people that that need distinctions, but ideas or events or things, whatever the case may be. This is the kind of argument that you want to make sure to make, is where people are very clear what you're talking about and what your argument applies to and what it does not apply to. Okay, let's move on to the next clip here. This one is really good. And this one's going to be challenging because it was a debate. It was 4 people and it was a hot topic. So, but I think Batya did a really good job here, and just want you to listen in.
I do want to get the response to this whenever it comes to the genocide question, because that's one that is very hot right now, specifically for the American audience. This is a key point of the intra-left debate around Joe Biden and his candidacy. So, Batya, I would like for you to respond and to make the case around why Israel is or is not committing a genocide. We'll stick on this question and we'll get some responses from over here as well. So, Batya, go ahead.
I don't believe Israel is committing a genocide. Precisely because of how Cenk defined the word genocide, which is the intentional targeting of a people based on their ethnicity or their race.
Okay, so start right there. There's actually 2 things here, I guess, that she did very well. Number one, I always try to use somebody else's definition or understanding. And she does that. She said, look, it's not a genocide based on what the guy who opposes genocide said, based on his own definition. So it's not like she's coming in with her own definition that nobody's agreed to. And I'll throw this up on the screen here. Keith Garrett, he points out, he says, if the premise is agreed and the reasoning is good, then the conclusion should be similar. If the conclusion is compatible, then the starting point is different or the reasoning is flawed. Let me focus in on that first comment. If the premise is agreed. So she's agreeing to the premise of what a genocide means. Cenk laid it out. He said, this is, earlier, he said, this is, how I would define a genocide. And he lays it out. And then she says, okay, I agree to that. And based on that, I'm going to say, based on your definition, I'm going to argue it's not a genocide for this reason. Now, I'm not going to try to decide whether I think she's right or wrong, because again, that's not the purpose of my episode. My episode is just to talk about some of the elements that I saw that we need to utilize when we're communicating with other people, whether it's just our neighbor and we're having a conversation with our neighbor, or whether we're in a formal debate, such as this one, or maybe we're giving a speech. These are the kind of things that are worth considering when we are communicating. Use the other person's definition or their understanding to the best that you can, or you would have to argue and say, look, we're not going to be able to come to terms with how you're defining this. For anybody that watched some of my review of Candace Owens when she had on Rabbi Barclay, there was a point where she said, I'm not going to be able to get on board with your definition of this. And it's just not going to work. We're not going to agree. So she was very clear. And this is the best way that we can communicate and even debate these kind of topics, is to make sure that there's no ambiguity in where we stand. If I agree with your definition, then great, we'll use it. If I don't agree with it, then maybe we try to reconcile it. If we cannot reconcile it, then what we have to do is just say, on this point, we're going to have to agree to disagree. So in this particular case, Batya is like, look, I'm good with that definition. Here's why it actually doesn't work for you in the way that you say. Let's continue on, because she does one more thing.
And that's clearly not happening here. I mean,
okay, so right there, so she first said, I agree with your definition of, like, I'm cool with it. We're accepting the premise here. Then she says it's not happening. And then in the background, you may or may not have heard, but Cenk he goes, really? Now watch her response.
We'll get to you.
Aren't you curious what
You're
I'm
up.
going to say?
You're up soon, but Dave is next.
Okay, so that was a perfect way to respond. And it might have been a little on the girly side, but that's fine. What do I mean by that? She could have got mad and said, hey, I haven't even said anything yet. And how are you disagreeing with me? But instead, she kind of phrases it in this really polite question. Well, aren't you even curious what I'm about to say? Right. So she kind of forces him to back up a little bit. Okay, well, you're right. Let me hear what you got to say before I disagree. And I think that's a good way to handle a debate or disagreement. I've used a similar, I've done similarly when I'm debating friends, like virtually every Friday night, I've got friends that come over and almost none of my friends are libertarian. We disagree on many things. And sometimes I will, I've said that. And sometimes they've said that to me like, boy, wait a minute, you haven't even heard what I'm going to say. Like, are you curious what I'm going to say? And I mean, I think her delivery was a little bit, um, it wasn't as assertive as I would have preferred, but it wasn't, it was also done in such a way where it's very disarming because the other person is kind of forced to say, okay, well, let's hear what you have to say. And the better off that you can do these kind of things, because when you're debating stuff like this, it can get heated. And the more that you can maintain your composure when other people are slipping, and it happens, everybody slips, right? Like you're listening, somebody says something you disagree with, and you go, no way, right? It's just very natural. And that's okay. I don't have a problem with that as long as it doesn't get out of control. The best response that you can make is to ensure that you're engaging and disarming them just enough. You don't have to try to dominate back. You don't have to be like, "Hey, you shut up. I'm not done talking." You don't have to do any of that. You can just simply say, "Hey, aren't you curious yet? But I haven't even said anything." And so the more we can keep our composure, the better off the conversation will go to begin with, because it helps keep tempers from getting too flared. And then when people are watching, it doesn't sound, and there's no nice way to say it, it doesn't sound like a shit show. And I felt like there were moments in the debate where it got a little hot, and that's okay. And there were some moments where I was like, okay, that wasn't necessarily a good response. Like, I'll ding Dave a little bit. I think there was one, maybe twice, where he's kind of interrupting and saying, no, no, no. And then he kind of like throws his hands up. And I think there's one moment where he throws his hands up and kind of turns back to the side a little bit. And is that the worst thing in the world? No, because he did it like one time and it was a 2-hour debate. So if in a 2-hour debate on a hot button topic, you kind of don't have the best composure for a moment or two, it's not the end of the world. But we want to make sure that it stays at a moment or two or even less if we can help it. If Dave had done it repeatedly, then he would have just looked like a bad character. In the same way where I said Dennis didn't come across very well because he, was looking straight forward, had his arms crossed, and he didn't seem to be, it didn't seem to me like he wanted to be there. So that's the impression that people get when you don't hold your composure. It's the same problem. But in this case, she did very well, even though she got interrupted before she had even given her position. So kudos to her on that. All right, what do we got here? We've got 2 more clips. I thought this was a good one by Schenk. So let's play this one.
Like, this is the reason I said Dennis lives on a different planet is he says, name one Israeli atrocity. Everyone out there that is.
So let me pause here just for a second, because prior to this, he had stated at least once, maybe twice, that Dennis was living on another planet, which is kind of an insult. And I think if you're going to use these kind of comments, you need to back them up. You can't just say them and expect that people are going to agree with you. So that's what he does. He says, "Hey, I think he lives on another planet. Here is why I'm saying this kind of crazy comment here." And then he goes into it saying this.
And Israeli supporters screaming into the camera, right now, right now. So, for example, Hamas killed 34 kids on October 7th. I came out immediately, condemned it in the strongest words. I can't believe it. Well, how is that helpful? It's immoral. It's counterproductive. It's dumb. It's terrible in every way. 34 poor Israeli kids. There are now 15,000 dead Palestinian kids.
Okay. And I guess I clipped it a little bit too soon, so I apologize for that. But he goes on and he suggests that even if the numbers were lower, like I think he said 9,000 or 6,000, it still would be a problem. So it reminded me of a movie I watched years ago called The Substitute. It had Tom Berenger in it. And it's a totally fictitious movie, of course, but Tom Berenger is he's a mercenary. And I think like a girlfriend or something like that was having a problem in a high school, or she got injured or something like that. So he goes in undercover as a substitute to see what's going on, because he thinks that maybe there's something shady going on. So he's undercover. He's actually a mercenary, and he's at a high school teaching. And the end of the story is that he uncovers like all these Nazis and these this plot, or these teenage or these high school boys who are doing some devious things as part of like their Nazi whatever. Well, in classroom, he's talking about the Holocaust, and somebody suggests that the number was too high, like 6 million, right? And we've heard the jokes about it. So what he does, he goes, "Okay, well, what number would you use?" And the person said, "Well, I think they said something like 600,000 or 300,000." And he goes, "Okay, well, 600,000. Isn't that still a huge number of people to be murdered, like slaughtered? Like, okay, it wasn't 6 million, fine. This number is equally as tragic." What I like what Schenk did there is he he focused on the number of 34 dead Israeli babies, which nobody is really disputing that I know of. And so then he says, okay, well, now it's 15,000 Palestinian children. And so he's making this point. He's like, look, if you think that 34 is bad, why wouldn't you think 15,000 is bad? And then where I cut it off, and I apologize, he goes on and he says, or if it's 9,000 or 6,000. So even if you start cutting it down, and so the point here is you don't have to be fixed on a number. In some cases, some people they can't help but say it's got to, we've got to keep it at 15,000. But instead, I would say, okay, in cases like this where the number is so high, it's acceptable to say, okay, maybe you don't think it's 15,000. Don't get fixated and say, I've got to stick with 15,000 because that's the only way I can make my point. No, you can make your point at 12,000, 10,000, 9,000, 6,000, 1,000. Like he could have went down much, much further. He could have went down and said 500, right? Because if you got 34, if people are outraged that 34 children were murdered by one side, and then the other side ends up killing even, let's say, 340, that's 10 times the number. And so the obvious question here is, if you believe this is bad when it's 10 times or even many more times, why aren't you equally outraged, or why aren't you at least equally concerned? And so I thought that was a very good debate point to make. And these are the kind of things that that I think go toward convincing people of your position. Because what you're doing is you're saying, I want to take your argument and I want to now frame it in my position. And so if you believe that in your argument that this is a problem, then you should also believe that it's a problem on some level. Like you on some level, you need to believe it. Right now, people might say, well, it's, they'll try to work their way out of it. But I think if you just focus on that and you kind of force them to reconcile 34 thousands, whatever number of thousands it is, and it becomes harder for them to reconcile. Now, it is harder to reconcile, say, 15,000 versus 1,000. But honestly, I think that if you get hung up on 15,000 and then it becomes an argument about the number instead, rather than what is the point here? The point is, this is why you're outraged. You need to be equally outraged here, or concerned at a very minimum. And I've seen a lot of arguments and debates where people get hung up on the number itself and disputing whether or not that was true. And it's not just this argument. It's not just this issue. It's other issues as well. People will get hung up on a number when they could easily use a lower number to make their point. And so you have to be aware, like, yeah, a lower number still makes my point. I'm comfortable lowering the number because at the end of the day, what I'm not trying to convince you of is that this many was the number that, in this case, we're not trying to convince you that it was 15,000 that have died. We're trying to convince you that too many, whether it's hundreds or thousands, too many have died and deserve equal concern when you started off with 34. So the focus is just getting somebody to be concerned about the response, and you don't want to focus so much on the number itself, because then it takes away what you're actually trying to communicate, which is you need to have an equal concern. That's the point, and you have to stay with that point. even if it means lowering some numbers. All right, so we're getting a little bit delayed here, a little bit behind. So let me do my last. So this is going to be about a 2.5 minute clip. This is the closing statements. I'm just gonna I've edited them kind of heavily so that I can just kind of focus on the points that I want to make. You'll have to go and watch the actual debate itself. It was a 2-hour debate. There's no way that I could play the fullness of the clips and have this much conversation. So I had to edit quite a bit, but hopefully it was only enough to make the points that I wanted to make without losing, too much context. So let's go ahead and play that.
I would phrase it this way: instead of trying to respond to a simple question, let's just take the last thing you'd like the audience to be able to take away with. So, Batya.
Okay, so the moderator starts off and he says, "Look, last thing that you want the audience to." So we gave him clear instructions. So I want you to hear how everybody does that.
I wanted to open with this, but I'm going to close with it instead. I'm going to mention all of the areas of common ground that we have here because there was so much of it.
All right.
Okay. I clipped out all the common ground that she laid out because it wasn't necessary to hear that. Just the fact that she said, okay, what I want the audience to take away is all the common ground that we have. I think that was very valuable. It's always good to remind people of the common ground that we share so that we don't get too focused on our differences. Because when we get too focused on our differences, we forget about the common ground. And the common ground can be important because that can help out later conversations. Later conversations, if I remember that I've had common ground with you when I'm having a later conversation, that plays a role. That plays a role in my thoughts about my own position. So it's always good to remind people, especially in a heated conversation like this, because you might otherwise think, man, they just started out disagreeing and they ended up disagreeing. So it was good for her to remind the audience and the members on the panel, this is where we agreed the things that we agreed upon. And I don't think anybody disagreed with her on any of those. She laid it out and she accurately said, this is what we agree on. This is what we agree on. I think she named like 5 or 6 things where, 5 or 6 points where everybody agreed. And so that's a good thing because that's a step forward in coming to some sort of resolution that everybody can agree upon. All right, let's continue.
Thank you, Batya. Dave, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Okay, so it was about 200 years ago that Thomas Jefferson had this great quote. I do believe it was in 1824, where he was speaking about slavery. And he said, I might butcher this a little bit, but he said, we've got the wolf by the ear, and we can neither afford to hang on to it nor let it go. And that's kind of the same way I feel about the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. It's been since 1967, man. You just can't do this to people anymore.
Okay, well said, Dave.
Okay, so that was Dave just kind of summarizing his position, and he did it by invoking something that people recognize. It's always good. Now, there was some debate there earlier on where they brought up the issue of slavery, and Mr. Prager was like, he disagreed with it, and that's fine. But the point being, when you're talking about a new topic, it's always good if you can bring up an analogy that people can understand, especially when what you're trying to communicate is, this is how I want you to understand my position. So let's look at something over here that we're not debating about, and let me present this to you and then say, this is kind of how I'm feeling here. Now, analogies can backfire very quickly because people tend to want one-to-one analogies. And if an analogy isn't one-to-one, a lot of people will throw it out. This is baby in the bathwater, just right on out the window. And excuse me. And that's not always a good thing. But beside that point, I think it's still worthwhile to try to utilize analogies to help people understand your position and use an analogy that they can readily understand that there isn't really a whole lot of disagreement about. And he furthers, at one point, he further goes on and says, at the time, yeah, people felt like there was no way out. But then 200 years later, we look back and we go, yeah, actually, we just had to do it. It just had to be done. And the same goes to here. We can't keep making our mistakes. So he basically did, those who don't, how's that phrase go? Those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. He basically says, we're going to repeat history in this particular case if we don't learn from other history that has some analogies that can play a role. All right, let's continue.
Go ahead, Dennis.
So I would love that too. Right now, most Palestinians would like to get rid of a Jewish state. I wish that weren't true. If it weren't true, I do believe there would be peace. I think that is the honest approach.
Now, I'm not a big fan of what he said here, but I don't want to really get into it. And the reason is he's ascribing something to a large group of people. And he's basically saying, like, look, these Palestinians, they don't even want peace. And I don't know that it's necessarily a good thing to have in your closing argument. But if that's the position that he holds and that's what he wants you to take away, then fine. But this next part here, this is where I took a little exception.
I just have to say, even though it's my final statement, I nevertheless have to respond.
Okay. No. The moderator has clearly told you that, here's the instruction for your closing argument. What is it that you want the audience to take away? But honestly, that's not like the moderator shouldn't have had to tell you that. That is what your closing statement is for. That is what you want people to take away after they've heard 2 hours of debate, back and forth, sniping, arguing, getting a little bit loud, all these different things. Arguing this fact, no, countering it with this fact or this event or what this person said somewhere else, what have you. After all of that, what is your takeaway? And then he's like, no, I want to argue. And I think this was poor form on his part. He should have focused on what is it that he wants people to take away. Because when I'm listening to the closings and I hear their takeaway, now I'm going to cycle through all the things that I heard. And I'm going to evaluate of all those things that I heard, is there merit to what they want me to take away? Is there some value add there that I should really consider after I've heard all the arguments? Let's continue.
The comparisons you make are remarkable. I mean, that the slavery of blacks and the status of Palestinians are comparable. It's such an insult to blacks.
Okay, so I'm not sure that he's in a position to say it's an insult to black people that Dave makes an analogy. And it's not so much that he's a white guy as it is that he's in this debate and presumably this is the first time he's hearing this analogy. So he hasn't had an opportunity to actually get any idea from the black community whether or not they would accept it. Like imagine if every black person in the United States watched this debate, which I know is not going to happen, but imagine that they did. Well, then the question would be, how many of them would agree based on what Dave is saying, whether or not that analogy works in today's situation? And do they feel insulted, or do they say, you know what, you're right, we should learn from our history so that we don't repeat it with another group of people, right? Even if that repeating is in a different manner, even if there's some different circumstances, about that, we don't want to repeat it where we're holding people down forcefully and then saying, well, we've held them down for so long, we just can't let go. We've been there. And so the black community might actually say, you know what, you're right. It was terrible that it happened to us, and we don't want it to happen to any other people. Please learn from our history. So I think he's making a big mistake here by trying to argue again in his closing statement. And in this case, speaking on behalf of a group of people that he has not had an opportunity to identify whether or not he's actually speaking accurately. So I think he's poorly using his closing statement.
Okay, so one final word: the pariah state of Israel. That is correct. That was what, in fact, Chuck Schumer said, Israel twice in his talk, that Israel is a pariah state. There's a reason that Israel is a pariah state. It's because the left-wing media in the world have decided to declare, along with Muslim countries, and Israel a pariah state.
Cenk?
Okay. So last thing. So he actually went through 3 different groups and he's making presumptions about 3 different groups. So he said, okay, the left-wing media, the blacks, and then the Palestinians. And so he used his closing statement here to say, to make assumptions and engage in what Dave would call collectivism by saying, well, the Palestinians this, the blacks this, the left-wing media this. Now, there may be some truth to some of the things that he said, but again, this is his closing statement, and it's not time for arguments, and it's not really good on his part to have not paid attention and said, look, this person over here across from me has laid out the problems with collectivism and individualism. So let me go ahead and engage in the very collectivism that he describes as a problem. Right. So that's what he did. And I think his closing was just not good. It was terrible, to put it bluntly. All right.
Go ahead.
So look, I care about both Israeli civilians and Palestinian civilians. And so if you say, oh, well, brilliant point about slavery. I said it about the North and the South before, hey, the black slaves would get rid of a white state. We can't have it. We can't have it. If we free them, they could kill us all. And they are so against the white state. They're so against America. We can never let them go. By the way, that is what is said in every occupation, in every empire, in every war. And after every war, they say, oh, look at how many of our people they killed. They killed our women, our children, etc. We can't make peace with them. And what does that lead to? It leads to more war, more killings.
Okay. So Cenk does the same thing basically that Dave does. He bounces off and says, look, let's talk about history. What have we learned from history? Well, it turns out that what we're doing here, even though it's not a one-to-one comparison, there are similarities, and we've seen it over and over and over in all these other countries and all these other conflicts. And earlier on, both of the two mention a whole bunch of I think Dave mentions a whole bunch of more recent conflicts, like Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think I can't remember the other ones, but he mentioned several of them. And then Cenk goes ahead and mentions a bunch of ones that are even earlier than that. And so they're both pointing out, we have history to learn from. We're not learning from it. So even though they disagree on many, many things, and they made that point somewhere in that debate where, Dave was like, look, we disagree on a lot of things. In fact, most things, but on this particular one, we do agree. Not only did they agree, but I don't know if they planned it this way or not, but they basically worked off of each other. So if you're going to be in a debate with a debate partner, you should actually work off of your, get some momentum from your debate partner. They should get some momentum from you. Dave and Cenk both did that. And then they made a good closing by leaving the audience to remember history. We have a history. We don't want to repeat it, or at least the bad elements of it. And this is how we are repeating it, right? That's their argument. And they did a very good job. Unfortunately, I don't think that Dennis and Batya were able to feed off of each other's momentum nearly as well, or at all in some cases. So it seemed like Batya was there to kind of rationalize and have a conversation. Dennis seemed there to just be angry about stuff and then kind of closed off and stiff. And then you had Cenk, I think it's Cenk or Shank. I'm not exactly sure how to say his name. And then Dave, and they were feeding off of each other. And even though they didn't even always agree. So like Cenk made the argument about genocide, for which Dave said, I don't agree with the genocide issue. Like he didn't agree with using that terminology in this conflict. So that's my review of everything. Now, I meant to start this out, but I had a little bit of problem with my audio, and so it kind of threw me off. What I meant to start off with by saying, and I'm going to close with this, you might ask, well, it would have sounded better at the very beginning, but you might ask, DL, who are you, or who is anybody to review these folk? Because they're all relatively they're all pretty intelligent people. And even though I don't think that Dennis did very good, he's still a smart person. Like he's not a dumb guy. The answer to that is everybody. Everybody is somebody, because you are an audience member. You are somebody that knows what you find interesting and appealing. And then if you want to communicate to other people about ideas, then you are somebody that can evaluate and say, okay, how did this come across to me? That's how I want to be. And so maybe I will take a lesson from, what to do from Dave, what not to do from Dennis, and so on and so forth, with all of those folk that were on the panel. You learn from these people. You learn from other people doing it. That's who you are. That's who I am. And I want to leave you with one note. When I was in Toastmasters, everybody has an opportunity to evaluate a speaker. And I remember when I started doing evaluations, the way it would work is I would listen to their speech and I would have just a few minutes to collect some thoughts and get up there and give a 2-minute response and say, all right, here's my feedback of your speech that you gave. Well, there were some people that were just really great speakers. And when I first started, I was like, I don't know what you could do better. Like, you were just great. You were phenomenal. Like, it was awesome. Like, and it was very, very difficult to actually evaluate them because you want to evaluate them for the things that they did well, the things that they didn't do so well, so that they could improve. And it was very hard at first to come up with anything that they could improve upon because I just like, man, you guys are great. You were so awesome at speaking. Well, as time went along, I actually was able to find things that I thought they could improve. And it actually was not so difficult. And I even got a reputation for being able to deliver good feedback. And people actually enjoyed it. Even the good speakers, the people that were very well polished and could prepare and deliver extremely well, they even appreciated my feedback. So, to the question of who am I or who are you, you are somebody that has a vested interest. That's who you are. And the more you do it, the better you will get and the better off it will help you when it's your turn. So that's why I do this. Not because I think I'm some great speaker. It's because I'm an audience member. I'm evaluating them, not only on the arguments that they're making, but also their delivery and how they're doing it. And then I'm taking notes so that when it's my turn, I can take all the good things that I've learned and try to apply those and then hopefully not employ the negative things. That way I become a good speaker too. And everybody has that opportunity. And maybe some of us won't be, me or anybody will not be as good as Dave on maybe a particular issue, but we can be better tomorrow, next week, next month, next year than we are today. And that is the goal to strive for. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you got so much out of it. You found it informative and inspiring. I want you to remember that the show airs Monday through Friday, 7 a.m., YouTube or Rumble. And then I also live stream to X. If you, sorry, I'm a little thrown off here just by things. So I apologize for the clumsiness. But you can subscribe to my YouTube channel or my Rumble channel. Go to youtube.libertydad.com or you can go to rumble.libertydad.com. While you're there, leave me a comment. Let me know how I'm doing. I enjoy reading the comments. And last but not least, if you are a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. I got some exciting episodes coming up this week. But for now, I'm